Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. We're in week 5 of our teaching series called The Tale of Two Kingdoms. And we're going to be talking about being citizens of the kingdom of heaven while still living in the kingdom of the world. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today. I'm so excited about this. I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, and Lori Frank. And just to clarify for everybody, I did this a couple weeks ago, is you guys are married, and you are married to each other, just so everyone knows who's watching and listening. I'm so excited to hear some great things from you guys today as we dive into our topic that we talked about on Sunday, which is the kingdom of God and men. I think it's going to be great to hear from both of you, your life experience, what you've seen around you in your own marriage and your own lives. And then I just want to throw a quick disclaimer before we start. If you're listening today and you're like, man, it feels like we're really only talking about men for the most part today. Well, that is intentional, and that's because next week we're going to be talking about the kingdom of God and women. So we'll be having this conversation kind of in reverse next week, as well as on Sunday as well. But today we're going to be, it's too much to probably cram into one sermon, so you split it into 2 different parts, which is probably a helpful deal. So anyway, we're going to be talking about that today. I can't wait. So let's start by doing this, Pastor, just to clarify. So we're kind of starting and grounding our discussion in the right place. I thought you did a fantastic job on Sunday of clarifying scripturally how men and women are equal, both created in God's image, but both created differently in God's eyes. And I just wanted to see if you could kind of recap and kind of draw that theme back out a little bit to help ground our discussion in the right place.
Sure. I mean, I think starting from Genesis to what Jesus talked about in Matthew 19 to what the epistles talk about, and that's the teaching. You've got 2 equal co-image bearers of God in male and female, and he makes male. He said it's not good that man should be alone, and he made woman, and it's kind of cool. It's that wordplay of he brought woman out of man, but both co-equal, co-laborers together for a mission, and they both image God, and and what you see is that each one of them separately do not do a complete image of God. Mm-hmm. They're both imaging God, and they're doing that also together. And the reason that we use the word, and now complementarian is a little bit of a loaded term nowadays, but that's really what you see in that is they complement each other. They're the same, but they are also unique.
And that right there already is kind of a countercultural thing to say. Just the foundation of what we're going to be talking about is already a little bit of a swimming upstream, going against the grain, as you said. And that your text Sunday, that a lot of these things came out of that 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14. And just to recap, I have never heard this passage preached in this way, but it really helped. You seem to define manhood out of that passage, just those couple verses. And so I'd love just that for the 3 of us, can we just kind of walk through, you had 4 different kind of pieces of the puzzle here. The graphic was that you have men in the center that act like men as the hub, and then you've got kind of these other characteristics. I don't know if that's the best word to use, but characteristics seems like what you were going for on Sunday. But let's start with the hub of acting like men. You used kind of Adam versus Jesus, it seemed like, to help clarify this. But what that phrase, like you said, like many things, can be used in the wrong way. What is the effective, the appropriate biblical way to take that phrase and apply it to biblical manhood?
The phrase "act like men"?
Yes.
Well, and to be fair, that 1 Corinthians 16, it can be applied to both men and women. I think you look at the book of 1 Corinthians, there's numerous times where both brothers and sisters are talked about. And you can also, some people would say, well, act like men is not the hub. I was using it as a hub to say, all right, it was almost an illustration and then a long illustration out of Genesis. And so the first part was, all right, this talks about prophet, priest, provider, and protector. The longer version of that, if you don't look at Genesis, is really Ephesians chapter 5. Those roles are fleshed out more in that Ephesians 5 passage, the very, very detailed one on marriage. But to me, people understand story and narrative, especially in this when you have a tense deal. And in this series, we've gone back to the Genesis 1, 2, and this time we added 3 as Paul does, as Jesus does, they go back to in the beginning. And so we're doing that quite often. But yeah, that's that whole idea. I would say it's loaded because it has been both. It's usually been misused, and I think you see that in the curse at the end. You see that particularly with males, and I said that males are the two ditches for males are either abuse or really domineering is maybe a better word.
Right.
Domineering, and that is they take the leadership role for themselves, and that's always our sinful tendency. I want it to be about me and my glory, and really what biblical manhood should be about is for the flourishing of the people around you and for the glory of God. And we're going to mess up all the time on that. That's what the gospel's for. And we want to see this through a gospel lens, just like this next week when we look at Proverbs 31. It can actually almost seem, it can be depressing if you're a lady and you look at this Proverbs 31 woman, but you have to look at it through the lens of the gospel. All right, this is the ideal, and where the ideal is lacking, that's the gospel comes in, and it has to be done in that lens.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that for me, the best thing was to try to say, all right, biblical manhood, you're not a boy, and you're not a woman, and that's not derogatory at all, because a boy is a boy. I mean, 1 Corinthians 11, when I was a child, I acted like a child. So there's no big deal if you're 10 years old and you're acting like a boy, then you're a boy. If you're 30 years old and you're still acting like that, then that's an issue. And women are amazing, but if you're a man, you're not a woman. They are distinct, equal, with great strengths, as well as you look at it, the curse has also taken some of those and made us where we have tendencies we got to be really, really careful of.
Yeah. I want to kind of walk through specifically these other 4 characteristics that you have here. But just to kind of overarching is, hey, be watchful, be strong, let all that you do be done in love. Those are the kind of the big 3. And then firm in faith. So, Lori, just wanted to ask you, sitting under this teaching on Sunday and your perspective as a woman, can you share some of the value and the meaning of seeing those traits in men, that loving, watchful, firm in faith, strong? What's the value of that for you as a woman?
All of them are. The watchfulness is the one that I think is unique, as far as not just in our lives these past 33 years. Of course, he is watchful for threats, external threats. We walk into a restaurant, and I always know he wants his back to the wall, or he doesn't want his back to the door of the room, because he has that situational awareness of his responsibility to protect. But it goes deeper in that I feel like as we've grown in oneness, there's a watchfulness for my development, a watchfulness for, am I okay? He doesn't always catch the clues, and even sometimes I'm not as open as I probably should be.
Right.
But he can tell something's going on, and so he's always trying to watch out for just my flourishing, and he's learned to spot the signs if I'm redlined or frustrated or not feeling loved and appreciated, maybe taken for granted. He'll pick up on that, and he's getting better and better all the time. So that it makes me feel so cherished, that with all that he's got on him, and when we look at this list of what a man is, gosh, I'm glad I'm not one, because it's a lot of pressure and it's a lot of responsibility, and it's frankly impossible apart from the empowering of the Holy Spirit. But it makes me feel so safe in life and relationships, that there's a partner that I have as we work out our assignment, that he's watching out for not just him, but he's taking responsibility for my well-being, and that watchfulness is precious.
There's a couple things you said that just right there that struck me I'd love to dive back into. And one of those is that you said the number 33. So you guys have been married for 33 years.
Isn't that right? 1989.
Yeah,
I think it's 33.
Whoever's listening, watching, if
Do
you're
the
good at
math.
math, you're already doing the mental math. But it's really interesting, and I think kind of challenging to hear you say that that's stuff that you guys are still actively working on together. And you kind of clarified that, Pastor, it sounds like you're still intentionally trying to be better in some of these things like watchfulness or whatever these characteristics are. And I think that's a great point of clarity that I'm hearing you both say neither one of you have arrived
100%.
in either one of these, in any of these areas. Whether
Yeah,
it's manhood or womanhood.
you always want to be learning. I mean, the two areas you always want to be learning in is leadership and in your marriage. Because you're never going to reach the top. It's like, I got this figured out. 33 years, we got this figured out. If you get to that point, you don't have it figured out. You just kind of gotten lazy, either in leadership or in marriage, and that tends to regress. But I mean, and part of that is just the fact that the distinctions that God has made us, both male and female, as well as, I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, her and I are very different on virtually every category.
Right.
And so, you've got to continually learn. And it's like, why does she respond? There's all those generalities. We're kind of the generality. If you look at the general differences, we fit both those. She's the most feminine lady I've ever met, which I just was like, that's awesome. That's so unlike what, not growing up with sisters and we didn't have any daughters or anything.
Yeah.
And so the whole woman is mystifying in a great way.
Yeah.
But obviously you want to learn. You want to learn, catch the clues, catch the nonverbals. I mean, some of them are just, if you ask, hey, a lot of guys early in marriage are like, hey, what's wrong? And if they hear nothing, they'll just like, oh, well, I guess nothing's wrong.
Yeah.
Well, no, there's something wrong. You just, you gotta dig a little bit.
Second thing that I thought was really interesting, it sounds like when you were talking about watchfulness, there's an element of this that is reactive, but what you're describing sounds proactive.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And I'd love to hear from either one of you on that, what some of that, could look like when it comes to watchfulness. And you mentioned a couple examples, but I thought that was a really interesting, I've never thought about that. I'm really just kind of talking to myself at the moment. If you guys have anything else you want to throw in, great.
No, I think you're just watching. You're watching the health of the marriage. You're getting some other people to speak into it. We've had seasons of just, and seasons are different. When you have toddlers, that's different. When you have teenagers, that's different. When we're now empty nesters. So, and that's different. I think the main thing is just trying to improve and work at it. There's been 100 different things that we've tried to learn and work at. And, I would say a lot of it comes down to, love and respect. And to brag on her. She taught this actually to a bunch of ladies yesterday, which we haven't downloaded, not yesterday or Sunday. We haven't downloaded how that all went. How do you teach a lesson that was kind of geared toward men to a class of no one but ladies? And some of those ladies in her class have, as I mentioned yesterday, everybody's been affected by men, positively or negatively. And so when men have not stepped into their role and have not done that, then the ripple effect scars, whether that be, the dad that left, whether that be the man that abused, whether that be whatever. And so we haven't downloaded about that, but I've also started on the Proverbs 31, and just always, it says, an excellent wife who can find, and I am excellent actually means, I literally was doing this 2 hours ago. Excellent does not mean what I thought it meant. It's oftentimes used for a warrior. We tend to think of a warrior for men, but the word for excellent that is describing the wife. And I married a warrior. I did. She's a warrior. She's been, her saying is ride or die. And so sometime we've almost died, but haven't, and goes back to covenant. And, I'm very blessed by, who I get to be married to.
Yeah. I'd love to dive in a little bit to some of that. Obviously you spent some time on Sunday, he just mentioned, teaching a group of women about some of these principles. What are some of the lies of the enemy? This is something we talk a lot about, believing lies that they kind of seep into us over time. What are some of the lies of the enemy that you feel like women have believed about, specifically about what biblical manhood is or what it looks like?
Well, first of all, I think ladies need to allow the men in their lives to honor their femininity and not to see that as an insult or something that they need to overcome. That design is beautiful, and there's something in the heart of the man that wants to do those things. But as we progressed through the text, it began to bring up some issues with some of the ladies in the class because of how they relate to their husbands, their dads, their male coworkers, their sons that they're trying to raise. And it boils down to we are citizens of a kingdom, an invisible kingdom. We are the visibility of the kingdom on earth. And so we have a higher authority. We have a different paradigm. And a lot of it is completely upside down compared to the culture. But it was God's design for our flourishing. And we can embrace those differences. Sometimes women can get off track into competition and resentment of the masculine vibe. But men can also, I've seen it abused on the other end, where they become domineering or they just see women as merely useful. And that is very demeaning. And I think that causes something in a woman's heart to rise up and say, I'm more than that. I am a full partner in this relationship with you. And when that's done, when that's acknowledged, that partnership is acknowledged, it becomes a lot easier to embrace men as leaders.
I wanted to take some of that idea. One of the things you mentioned yesterday, you spent some good time on clarifying what manhood is not. And those are a couple of great examples, and that word partner, how important that is. But what are some of the ways that you've seen or that, commonly you see as a pastor, of our church, that manhood is distorted or misapplied? And some of that stuff's just grabbing scripture in the wrong place. It's not just what the culture says, but it's misunderstanding what God says about it. What are some of those often?
Well, and there's probably 10. I would say in general, what you see is, and this isn't good for husband or wife, but when husbands use the text of the wife toward the wife, he'll take the wife verses and remind the wife of that.
Right.
And actually, that's not the way it is, because the address is to the wives. So whether it be leadership or whatever, it's like, oh, you need to know your verses, and so, when guys get in the flesh, they'll quote the part of the ones that they think will challenge or demean the woman. And so I'd say part of it's just like, stick to your own verses, first of all. It's like, stick to your verses. Husbands, stick to the ones about husbands, and wives, stick to the ones about wives. So in general, I would say twofold, Christian. Culture has, and again, this is this is a loaded topic, obviously. Yeah. So I would say, so that's why it's the longest sermon I've preached in about 5 years yesterday as well, as I was reminded as I walked off. That's the longest sermon you preached. So I would say in the world, it's usually one of two things. Either there's obviously a movement to just get rid of gender, which is, that's a different conversation. But intellectually, that's just a very hard argument to make if you look at just pure data. So number one is trying to erase gender, and I think God made a beautiful design with gender. Or honestly, right now, and I tried to fight against this, and that is that men are the doofus. I'm just saying, look at virtually all of culture, and if there's a man in a movie or whatever, rarely is he exemplifying anything remotely about masculinity that is there. I mentioned yesterday, the last one I could remember of a movie that actually showed some really strong characteristics of what is biblical leadership, self-sacrificial leadership, is a movie I don't even know many people saw called The Quiet Place with John Krasinski, where he actually gave himself up for his son, for his wife and daughter. I was like, that's awesome. But most of them, the guy's a doofus. He's either the toxic guy that's a bully and insecure, and he's just basically, like we talked about yesterday, a boy who can shave, or it's super passive. And I said the thing that men have to fight against, and if they get pushback, either from our tendency is to get passive and just like, well, you know what, I'm not going to do that. So I would say there's two arenas in which men have to fight against, in the sense of what culture says. But as Lori mentioned, honestly, the church hadn't done a great job of this at all. And it usually goes into two ditches as well. In ditch number one, you see with the Theo bros out there, I would call it extra biblical complementarianism or hyper complementarianism. Hyper is the wrong word. It's not that you believe it more. You actually take it and you extrapolate principles way past where the Bible does.
Weaponizing.
You weaponize it, and then you take it way further. It's like, your boss shouldn't, or your woman shouldn't. I mean, like, for example, I get asked all the time, should a woman work outside the home? Well, like, you can't read Proverbs 31 without seeing that that's allowed. Well, it's not neglect of family and that kind of thing. But I mean, this is a boss lady in Proverbs 31. She's a CEO kind of, but you just see people that take that and to me, take it out of context. The second thing, though, honestly, churches like ours are different in the regards to this. You look around our services at every campus, there are a ton of men. And I think in our bubble, we get used to that. You just statistically look at churches today, and men are not there. And whether that's the church designed it that way or they're whatever they're doing. Now, Jesus is the head of the church. Women are the backbone of the church for sure. But if men are not stepping into that, everybody loses. Yeah. And so I would say, again, the hyper complementarianism that's used to demean woman is one fault that they do. And on the other hand, not leaning into the strengths of biblical masculinity. I mean, biblical masculinity is a high calling. And most men, what I tried to do yesterday is call men up, not beat them down.
Right.
Because most of the time men's conferences and men's sermons are like, you jackwagon, you're terrible, blah, 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 blah. And conviction is great, but not condemnation. And men typically, if you ask them to do something hard, they'll do it. Typically, if you're like, hey, I'm setting the bar high, and we tried to do that yesterday, they'll at least try there. So that was the goal. And the same thing with ladies as well. And just some of the tendencies, and I heard it a long time ago, the tendency, and again, I hate to use this term because it's so loaded, but the tendency that you see in the curse, the tendency for a man is to neglect his wife. And the tendency for a woman is to nag her husband. And both of them end up going the wrong way. So, again, I'm sure somebody will say nag's the wrong word. I'm just saying, women are more verbal, and that's the way they can. Anyway, I'm digging a deeper hole. Read the book of Proverbs, and you see that is an issue. Yeah. That is an issue.
I'd love to get a little personal here and ask you guys if you're comfortable, just some of the themes we've been talking about, how some of these have played out just in your own marriage, whether that's good or bad. I know that's a tall order asking an Enneagram 8, open up, but
she's an Enneagram 4, so
you're ready to go.
She's ready to go.
You've been waiting on this moment. Yeah. So, how have you guys seen this play out in your own marriage?
Well, I think as I've been thinking and processing the message and trying to just examine my own heart, there are some glaring failures on my part, of course, over decades together of, like he said, just speaking words that tear down or that manipulate or attempt to control. A woman's greatest desire in her number one earthly relationship is to be fully known and fully loved. Right. And that oneness, Peter tells us, don't give in to fear. And the fear is, I'm not going to get my needs met if I let him lead the way. And so, biblical examples, Sarah manipulated the situation trying to help God with Abraham's calling. I look at Jesus' mother at the wedding in Cana, where she did such a masterful job of just approaching him with a need. There's no more wine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She didn't give him a to-do list. She didn't tell him, here's how I need you to solve it. She just looked at the people he was present with and said, do whatever he tells you.
Yeah, such a good line.
Do whatever he tells you. And that's the model that I'm looking for. Or Miriam, who was in competition with Moses and jealous and striving against him, criticizing him, not just criticizing him personally, but criticizing him to people he was trying to lead. That's a ditch that I think every woman wants their husband to know them and lead them, but letting go of the fear of losing control and a lot of that's brought on by water under the bridge. Maybe they've been burned before, but I would think every guy would love a chance to get off the hook and have a fresh start, and that takes courage.
Yeah. I would say this also, we talked about public criticism yesterday a little bit and how that chops a man down. I can honestly say I cannot remember a single time where Lori's done that. I honestly can't. We've had some serious discussions in private, but I cannot remember a time where, she has done that publicly. I can remember a number of times, still have to fight against it, but especially, I would say in the first 20 years even, the neglect part, because you chase either hobbies or accolades, all those things, to the neglect where she is not put on the value that she should have been. And so, a lot of it, there's been a lot of grace in the marriage, for sure, especially from her, toward me. And, but yeah, it's a work in progress. So there's not a time where you just arrive, but you gotta fight for it. And a lot of times, a simple thing, learning like, all right, not growing up with sisters or anything like that. It took me 10 years. I know this is kind of not 10 years. I still got to work on it. But, I'm processing it. Does she want me to listen to her?
Right.
Does she want me to listen to her, or does she want me to solve it? My default is still, she'll say something, I'm like, wait, do X, Y, and Z. Why don't you just do this? Why don't you do that? And that's, any guys out there listening, if you're newlyweds, you probably need to ask, am I trying to help her solve a problem, or am I trying to have, or we'd have an intimacy where she's trying to share some feelings. And so we've worked on that for sure. We've had some good folks speak into our life as well. That's
great. All really, really, really great, helpful tips. I wish I had time to sit here and take notes. I have to go back later.
You're getting off script, I think. I don't remember any of these questions.
Yeah, I know. We're just going with it. Yep. It's going to be fun. Here's a place I'd love to get to practically. What is a good place to start for men who, they heard the sermon yesterday, they're listening today, and they want to live out God's calling on their life to be a man on a consistent basis? Where would you point people to start?
I would say take one step. The tendency is for them to walk out yesterday. And as I said yesterday, the tendency is to walk out yesterday and I'm going to go from 0 to 60. And that's awesome, but that'll usually last till Wednesday, and they'll crash and burn. So try to take one step with your family. It might be the lead. You might apologize. Maybe there's been something brewing, and you're like, "I'm sorry." If it was just a sense of conviction that that the family's been, or especially the wife has been like second, third place, so just start there. I would say for all the men, we didn't even get on this yesterday, but you need to have a couple of brothers around you that will speak into you, because you can get in the ditch. Guys can get in the ditch in a hurry. They just can get in the ditch in a hurry. And if they don't have just some folks that love them and are watching out for them, then they tend to lose whatever momentum. But in a general sense, I would say pick one thing that you can do that's tangible that you weren't doing, as far as because really all biblical leadership really is your deal's a bigger deal than your deal's a bigger deal than my deal. That's really what it's like. I'm going to put your deal above my deal. You see that in Philippians 2. And so the question is, can I say, hey, your deal's a bigger deal than my deal. So maybe you watch football every Sunday afternoon. Of course, right now it's kind of easy because it's a dry time in sports. There's like nothing. You got a little bit of golf, and that's about it. But your baseball hadn't started, football's over. So, but pick one thing and say, your deal's a bigger deal than my deal. And then try to get some momentum, because honestly, momentum is a big deal. If they can just get a little bit of hope going in the right direction, then it can snowball. But a lot of times there's a lot of hopelessness out there. And I would say for the ladies, listen, when he tries, just, Tarzan, you're doing awesome, because again, we will tend to repeat what is rewarded.
Right.
And We're not complicated like that. And on the other hand, if he goes out there and he does it and it's not done well, which it probably is not going to be done well. I mean, he might mispronounce a Bible name or something if he reads the Jesus Storybook Bible to the kids. Yeah. If he mispronounces it, do not correct it. Just who cares if it's, who cares if it's Malachi or Malachi? It doesn't matter. Just let him go.
It's Malachi, just to clarify. That's how you pronounce it.
Oh, we have a definitive word.
No, it's not either. He's talking to some professor that said that.
Yeah. Here's a kind of follow-up to that. What are some things that you would recommend for women to do that can kind of help men feel confident in their calling that God's given them? I know you've mentioned a couple examples, but would love to kind of pull that out farther.
Well, I think, Bruce, your point of affirm the positive. You don't he's probably aware of his shortcomings, and he affirming any positive step in any direction would be first and foremost. Second would be, like I said, maybe let him off the hook. I hear so many women speak with such contempt toward the men in their lives, and they just can't get past a previous failure. They want their pound of flesh, and that's so counterproductive. It feels good in the moment to remind, but I can tell you that is bitter fruit in the long run, and you will tear your house down trying to build it that way. Yeah. And encourage the man to build margin into the pressures of life where he can get some support, get some guys around you, make that time, and then let him know that you're receptive to him building increased margin where you can pursue oneness, where you can spend a Sabbath together, pursuing spiritual goals together, discussing what God's doing in each of your lives, because nothing builds intimacy like that kind of deep sharing and vulnerability of, here's what God has revealed to me. What do you think about that? Those are some of my favorite conversations that we have just around the dinner table of, hey, I read this today. Isn't this amazing? And I feel like I know your heart as I see you respond to God's communication.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Yeah. We get a sneak peek of that Thursday afternoon. We meet to talk response, how we're going to end the service. And it's almost every week there's something where he's like, you know what's crazy that I saw in the passage this week? I've never
every
seen
time.
Before. You probably get that times 100.
I've heard it.
I get one
all.
little small thing, and it's, but that's great. And what it sounds like is you don't have a script on the table of, here's the question. Maybe sometimes you have here's the 5 questions I'm asking you, but a lot of it is just built out of you're sitting across the table from each other having conversation, and these things kind of happen. It
is for sure, but I would say there's definitely seasons of life where you have to be intentional about building it in, and we've done all of those things. There's stuff out there, 20 questions or 30 questions, and sometimes she'll go, all right, you ready for your quiz today?
Yeah.
And
I love those would you rather type questions because
I mean,
it never ceases to surprise me. I think I know him so well, and then sometimes he'll, like we did this one where we were in an arena and there were all these different animals. You had to choose 2 to protect you, and the rest were going to be against you. And he chose lions and bears.
No. The thing was, it was one of them was like 10,000 rats or something.
Yes,
it's like, would you rather have 10,000 rats or 4 bears or 2 lions or whatever? And I was like, where are you getting it? And then what was kind of crazy was, here's a little insight is, I don't think there was ever a correct answer.
Yeah,
it's not like, okay, science just said that 10,000 rats will beat 4 lions or whatever. None of that stuff. And I was like, well, what's the right answer? Yeah. So like, well, there's no answer. We just wanted to
it's
dialogue.
A thought experiment.
It's dialogue.
You know what the one is right now that I heard is that are there more wheels on earth or doors? That's the big debate. It's a similar thing. So I'm just setting you guys up.
Is there an answer to that?
Dinner. There's not. I mean, it's just, so you just pick one side or the other and you try to figure it out. So I'm giving you guys more that you can do.
We need to ask ChatGPT.
Well, again, we're in the empty nest syndrome.
Right.
we're going to talk about this because it's the overflow of what we do in ministry. She teaches a large ladies class of the same text that we're going through. So some of this is built in, but I want to remind us, during the times where you got so much more condensed, whether it be kids or, toddlers or all that kind of stuff, there is so many tools out there. The main thing is just be intentional.
Take a personality test and discuss the results.
Yeah, we're not Enneagram cult followers or anything, but I would say we have had.
It's very insightful.
It's very insightful. Yeah. We've spent hours at times just dialoguing because I'm like, oh, that's what a 4 does. All right, well, that helps me understand why this makes her happy or this makes her sad, because it goes back to, what does he tell the husbands in 1 Peter 3:7? Live with your wife in an understanding way. Literally means live with your wife according to knowledge. So the more knowledge I can get, whether it be Enneagram or whether it be about 10,000 rats, that's not going to not help.
Yeah. 2 more questions. One that's kind of a very loaded one, and then we'll get really practical with some resources. I wanted to ask you, because we get so many questions from people around gender, and we get a lot from women who are trying to navigate some of these things and figure them out. I'm sure you're interacting with people with some of these on a weekly basis, but has the idea of biblical manhood elevated you as a woman, or do you feel like it's devalued you as a woman?
Definitely makes me feel honored when it's the Jesus way. He was such a perfect example of honoring the image of God, even in women that you would look at and say, she doesn't have a lot going for her. The woman who touched the hem of his garment, he did not respond to her in disgust as an unclean person. He acknowledged that she had accessed his power.
Yeah, called her daughter.
And that called her daughter, yes. And the woman caught in adultery. There's so many examples of how he elevated women. And so when a man is emulating his manliness, of course we're going to feel empowered and seen and valued for not just our usefulness, but by the image of God on us. And that's been my experience.
That's great. I think about on the other side of that for men, Matthew 3, Jesus' baptism, he had done nothing. And he said, hey, this is my son who I'm pleased with. And that's what he lived his identity out of, that was spoken over him. So both sides of that for men and women. And we're going to talk more about even that next week.
I can't wait.
Yeah, we're doing this again next week in reverse. Pastor, I wanted to ask you, we get questions in this kind of frame a lot. What would be some recommended resources for people who want to, whether that's learning more or continue to dive into this, or they've got scars and they want to kind of wrestle through some of these things?
Sure. There's so many things out there depending on kind of where you are right now. I would say, let me give you 3. I'd say just biblical manhood. I think anything by Tony Evans is going to be really good.
Okay.
He's got one. I don't know if it's been retitled, No More Excuses, but it's a book on men. So Dr. Evans is always fantastic. I would say when it comes to marriage, if you are married and want to do that, the best theology book behind it that's not too terribly hard to understand is Keller's Meaning of Marriage.
Yeah.
Really, really good. And then obviously with the whole transgender stuff going on right now, and there's a chapter out of a book called The Secular Creed by Rebecca McLaughlin that is helpful. It's not, it's 12, 15 pages long. Right. But I think for those that are like, I wish you'd have said some more about that, I was like, hey, it's the longest sermon I've ever done anyway. So you added that, I don't know, we'd still be going. So I would say that chapter is a pretty good one. And there's a lot of, but she has a nice kind of biblical understanding of that and makes some, arguments, and yet with some degree of, not some degree, but with the type of tone that you would want to have.
Very helpful. Hey, this was great. I have learned so much just in the last little bit. I'm excited. I do go back and listen, by the way. It's because we're always trying to make this work as we're talking, and then later I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that was said, or, that didn't sink in. So I hope you listening, watching, hope you've been encouraged today. The goal of this, we say this every week, it's worth repeating, is just to help you follow Jesus. That's what we're going for. We want to make disciples of Jesus. And so hopefully this is going to do just that. And next week, we're going to be circling back, talking about the kingdom of God and women. We'll be talking about that on Sunday. I'm looking forward to that. I know you mentioned you have some nervous energy about it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting.
It'll be good.
And then we'll be back, the three of us, next week to continue to talk about it. Cannot wait for that discussion. So please continue to send us your feedback. We've gotten some really nice emails even in this series. I need to forward some of these over to you to see just people who have been encouraged over the last several weeks by your teaching and by our podcast episodes. So thank you for sending those in. Keep sending us questions, anything you want us to cover. We'd love to cover as many of those as we can. And here's, you know how I've really messed this up a few times by trying to get us all to do it at the same time. But if I can nominate you to close us out, we close it out just like Sundays by saying you're loved and sent. Can you tell the people that they're loved and sent today?
You are loved and sent.
Yes.